one of the earliest antidepressants, including the MAO inhibitors, of which only 2 are still in current use, now 70 years after their initial appearance. ECT continued to be used for the severely depressively mentally ill, in which it is most beneficial and most indicated. The techniques of ECT have undergone many technological revisions, and now it is a far safer and tolerable therapy. Somewhat related to it, in the same avenue of trying to stimulate the brain, has been, in the last 20 years or so, transcranial electric and magnetic stimulation therapies. These have not borne out to be as effective as was initially hoped. And concurrently, we had the several-decade love affair with all kinds of psychotherapies, which continues to this day, beginning largely with psychoanalysis after World War II. In this country and Great Britain became the home of the development of psychoanalysis as a discipline, and from it, in the centers of study, largely in university hospitals and medical schools in England and especially the United States, we began to develop other psychotherapies, brief interventions, cognitive therapy, behavior therapies, group therapy, individual counseling, to treat especially the non-biologically caused mental illnesses, and to use them to supplement the medication approaches of and for the chronically biologically mentally ill. Lastly, our current wave of mental health reform, since especially the 1960s, has been deinstitutionalization. There were still abusive practices in the government-sponsored and funded mental health hospitals called state psychiatric hospitals in this country. And these were seen as promoting, unfortunately, institutionalization that was to stay hospitalized lifelong, and deinstitutionalization as a movement was a reaction to the view dominant at the time, because until the modern era of psychopharmacology, we had no effective treatments whatsoever, that mental illness was lifelong, which was true, but that it required lifelong inpatient treatment. A sidebar, if you will, unfortunate consequence of the deinstitutionalization movement is that, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, as we cut too many state hospital psychiatric beds, in outpatient resources, as even initially outlined in the Comprehensive Mental Health Center Act of President Kennedy, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, in the 1960s, which resulted in the establishment of mental health centers, outpatient clinics for the treatment of the mentally ill in the 1960s and beyond, was not supplemented by other services that the mentally ill needed, that have really come to the fore of our attention and growing corrective efforts, such as housing and 24-hour supervision outside of the all-encompassing safe environment, supposedly, of the inpatient state psychiatric hospital and community or city, if you will, especially in these facilities that were so self-sufficient and really cities or towns unto themselves with every service that you can think of available. So what has happened is that we've had waves of reform, each seizing upon the current ideology or new treatment with its own improved effectiveness over what had been used before, being hailed as the solution while neglecting the realities of the long-term nature of biological mental illness requiring lifelong care in various forms. So we have had the other consequence everyone knows about that is called in general trans-institutionalization, with hospital beds, publicly and privately, since the 1970s, but especially in the 80s and 90s, being cut by over 2/3, dumping the mentally ill into the streets, jails, and emergency rooms, and posing enormous problems for Western societies who thought we could get away on the cheap with the treatment of the chronically mentally ill. Now, earlier I made reference to the current two, if you will, mass shooting incidents. Now, the one involving the school really does not meet the definition for a mass shooting incident, but is a school shooting. To qualify as a true mass shooting incident, you have to have an individual or individuals like Klebold and Harris at Columbine High School in Aurora, Colorado in 1995, I believe, or perhaps it was 99. In any case, they murdered people numbering in the teens, wounding others. Our earliest riveting example in current living individuals' active memory was the case of Charles Whitman at the University of Texas at Austin from the Bell Tower in 1966 when he shot and wounded over 30 people, and I believe ended up killing either 13 or 16 people. This was in 1966 and was totally kind of an anomalous event. It was not well understood at the time. He was found on autopsy to have a brain tumor. But he was particularly perplexing because he was a straight-up student, quiet guy, but had the unrecognized, perhaps, marker of being a loner, which we now know is often associated with mass shooting incidents. But to be a mass shooting incident, one has to, unfortunately, take the lives of 3, or more commonly the definition that's accepted is 4 individuals or more. Now, why I make reference and utilize this as our ending item of consideration and link it to mental health reform is that we have had now basically at least 3 decades, and now it is an epidemic of mass shootings. And a discussion continues to struggle with, at all quarters, academic, law enforcement, public policy, political, treatment circles, etc., whether or not mass shooters are all mentally ill. Now, the current political line based on years of research epidemiologically, is that the chronically mentally ill are almost universally nonviolent. They're quiet, retiring. They may babble about their hallucinations. A very, very few may engage in problematic behaviors. Approximately 30 years ago, I recall that there was a gentleman in New York City who was repeatedly committed for assaultiveness and chronic delusions. He'd be released, go off his medicines, and he was a really problematic individual. But he didn't shoot or kill anyone. But we've had a number of incidents, including Mr. Ferguson on the railroad line outside New York City, who murdered, I think, 6 or 9 individuals with a semi-automatic pistol, just going through the railroad cars, randomly shooting people, and was clearly delusional and quite mentally ill. These are always legal problems, whether to grant a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity or to go ahead and, if you will, ignore the mental health dimensions and try them as a competent adult to make sure that they receive a life sentence in prison, which is sort of the public perception, will, and wish. In any case, the current thinking has been to defend the mentally ill in the discussion publicly of their role in driving the incidence of mass shooting incidents. The worry is, which is verbalized gently, carefully, and perhaps not enough, because the mental health community fears that if the mentally ill are stigmatized in this fashion as being responsible for most of the mass shootings, they will have retaliation, continue to be brutalized, unfairly treated and contained within the prison system, and not receive treatment. And the treatment-oriented viewpoint of advocacy that if they had treatment, these episodes would not have occurred. So studies have shown that the chronically mentally ill are quiet, sit on the porch, smoke cigarettes, watch television, do little else. They're very passive. When they are in urban environments and on the streets as homeless, they are usually overwhelmingly more likely to be victims of assaults than to commit such crimes themselves. But the problem is that we regularly, quite frequently, at least every few months, if not more frequently, have instances in which openly mentally disturbed, chronically psychotic individuals who have murderous behaviors driven by psychotic delusions commit shootings due to many new factors, such as perhaps the availability of firearms, which are far more readily at hand than when I was a child. And I'm in my late 60s, so there's a long enough span of time in my life experience to have witnessed that kind of change and be able to testify and attest to it, even on an individual observational basis. But what is clear in mental health reform from that perspective is that we have lost grasp and control of the treatment needs and the scope and size of them for the chronically mentally ill in the last 30 years on the outpatient basis. And we will continue to have an increased number of incidents of violence and commission of anti-person crimes by just enough of the mentally ill.